So good afternoon, friends, and welcome to Rooted and Rising, Voices of Courage in a Time of Climate Crisis, a special event sponsored by the BTS Center and being offered as part of the 2021 United Church of Christ General Synod gathering. The title of this event comes from a book published in 2019. I actually only have one tab left. I removed a few earlier, but it was peppered with tabs. And we are gathered here this afternoon to learn from and with the book's editors and some of the contributing authors. We are gathered as fellow pilgrims, grappling with the weight of climate change and seeking spiritual practices and perspectives to renew our capacity for compassionate, purposeful, and joyful action. My name is Nicole Dieroff. I am ordained in the United Church of Christ and serve as program director at the BTS Center. Today, I am happy to serve as your host for this event. I'm grateful to my colleagues from the BTS Center, Reverend Alan Ewing Merrill and Kay Ahmed, who are helping with the tech behind the scenes to support this event. Please, Alan and Kay, as you are able, feel free to say hello in the chat. We will be making intentional use of the chat throughout this event, as I'll be offering prompts for you to respond to. So if engaging with the chat enhances your learning, please do so, join us there. And if you find the chat distracting, if you're one of those folks who it's just too much, please shut it down. Feel free to respond to my prompts on a notepad or simply through quiet reflection. We ask that you remain muted throughout this gathering so everyone can hear our guest speakers. You're welcome to have your video turned on or off depending on what's most comfortable for you. We have intentionally chosen a Zoom meeting format in hopes of creating a community vibe for this event. Over the next hour and a half, we'll listen to readings by our guest authors, create space for you to share stories, dialogue on topics identified by our authors, and we'll close with a contemplative practice. Let's get rolling. First, a little about those of you joining us. Please share in the chat where you are logging in from today. I'm in Portland, Maine, but I see Portland, Oregon, Wisconsin, Connecticut, Vermont, DC, New York, Nebraska, Illinois. So much more. Wonderful. Bring those greetings from all over this country and maybe beyond. Ohio, Colorado, Michigan. Hello, friends. We're so glad you're here. Now, could you please put in the chat what the weather was today in your location? What weather did you experience in your location today? Ooh, we got some gloomy, soggy, rainy, hot, sunny, humid. My son's camp had to do something different than planned because of rain today. Lovely. Feel free to scroll through, see what weather people have experienced. And now I invite you, in connection with our theme for this gathering, can you please share an example of weather weirding that you've experienced recently? Go ahead and switch what you're putting in the chat from what you experienced today to some sort of weather weirding you've experienced. I know here in Maine, I've been watching all the towns that have their town ice rinks struggle to keep those open this winter because there was just not a long enough stint of cold weather. Icing instead of snow, 106 with flash flood warnings, wildfires, ice storms, heat dome, an extra hot summer, downpours and flooding, the freeze in Dallas in February and related power outages. Thank you, friends, for sharing this. Thank you for gathering this afternoon to be a part of Voices of Courage in a time of climate crisis. Thank you for choosing to be right here, right now, with this particular gathering of people. I'd like to introduce you to Reverend Alan Ewing Merrill, the BTS Center's Executive Director, to bring a word of greeting. Alan.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I just want to offer a word of greeting and welcome as well. It is such an honor to have all of you with us this afternoon for this special 33rd session of the General Synod. We're grateful that you have chosen to join us for this special event. As Nicole mentioned, I serve as the Executive Director of the BTS Center, a role that I stepped into just about 2 years ago, following in the footsteps of my predecessor, Bob Grove Markwood, whom some of you may know. As you may know, the BTS Center is the missional successor to the former Bangor Theological Seminary in Maine, which for 200 years was a seminary that took seriously its mission to educate and equip faith leaders for service in congregations in Northern New England and beyond. I have a feeling we might have some BTS alumni with us in the Zoom room today. And if so, I would invite you just to take a moment to say hello in the chat and introduce yourselves by the year that you graduated. I would love to see those in the chat box. We take great pride in those whose lives and ministries have been formed and shaped by their experiences at Bangor Theological Seminary. And we always value opportunities to connect with our alums. So in fact, I've written a special message for alumni of Bangor Theological Seminary who may be with us at General Synod. You'll find a link to that message in the chat box. Although no longer a degree awarding institution, today the BTS Center seeks to catalyze spiritual imagination with enduring wisdom for transformative faith leadership. To catalyze spiritual imagination with enduring wisdom for transformative faith leadership. Today we do that by offering theologically grounded programs of continuing education and spiritual formation, including workshops and retreats, learning cohorts, public conversations, and projects of applied research. We're inspired by the vision of human hearts renewed, justice established, and creation restored. And so today, many of our programs aim to equip faith leaders, clergy, of course, but also dedicated laypersons, nonprofit leaders, chaplains, spiritual directors, students, university and seminary faculty, and denominational executives with the knowledge, skills, mindsets, and practices that are needed for effective and faithful ministry in a time of global climate devastation. So we hope that you will follow the work of the BTS Center at thebtscenter.org. And if you ever find yourself visiting Portland, Maine, a wonderful place to live, work, serve, or visit, we'd love to have you stop by for a conversation. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the particular resource around which we are centering this afternoon's program, this wonderful collection of 28 reflections, questions to ponder, and spiritual practices, all focused right at the heart of spiritual leadership and the climate crisis, called Rooted and Rising, Voices of Courage in a Time of Climate Crisis, edited by Reverend Dr. Leah Schade and Reverend Dr. Margaret Bullitt-Jonas, who are with us today. Last summer, we at the BTS Center convened a group of about 70 people who read this book together and met weekly over the course of 7 weeks for deeper engagement with the book and with some of the authors represented within its pages. And we are so glad to continue this engagement with all of you this afternoon. We're glad you're with us. Back to you, Nicole.
Thank you, Alan. I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to bring together 4 thought leaders and environmental activists as conversation partners for this event. Kay is going to share longer bios for them in the chat. But I want you to know that each of these people is a trusted colleague and friend in this work to respond to climate change with spiritual imagination and courage. Leah Schade is Assistant Professor of Preaching and Worship at Lexington Theological Seminary in Kentucky. Margaret Bullitt-Jonas works on creation care for the 2 Episcopal dioceses in Massachusetts and for the Southern New England Conference of the United Church of Christ. Natasha DeJarnett is an Assistant Professor in the Christina Lee Brown Environment Institute at the University of Louisville Division of Environmental Medicine. And Jim Antal serves as Special Advisor on Climate Justice to the General Minister and President of the United Church of Christ. Thank you, Leah, Margaret, Natasha, and Jim, for your ongoing leadership and your presence with us today. We are going to start this gathering by listening to each of our guest authors read excerpts from their chapter in Rooted and Rising. Leah, let's begin with you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And I'm actually in a hotel in Virginia Beach, and just want to make sure. Can you all hear me? I had to switch internet, and okay, good. All right, so
you sound great.
Okay, good. That is wonderful. So just want to thank the BTS Center and also the United Church of Christ for allowing us to have this opportunity to talk with you. I want to share with you just some excerpts from the chapter that I wrote for Rooted and Rising. The chapter is called Building the Eco-Ethical Ark in the Age of Climate Disruption. And in this chapter, I make the case that we need to move away from the concept of simply creation care, which sounds really wonderful, but really does not convey the urgency that's needed to act on what is happening in the world around us. So in this chapter, I propose adding 3 other alliterative phrases: creation clarity, creation compliance, and creation compassion. Creation clarity is something that is important to me as a homiletician. I teach preaching and worship. And I have argued that preachers have a key role to play in helping congregations understand that attending to environmental and humanitarian issues is a matter of faith and moral and ethical obligation. Creation clarity is needed to convey the necessity of addressing the climate crisis. And I know some of you one person was asking, well, what is global weirding? It's not just global warming anymore. It's all of these extreme weather events that we're seeing: raging fires, floods, droughts, storms across the planet in this past decade. This is an urgent all hands on deck moment. And faith leaders need to step into this crisis with leadership to help elicit a depth of wisdom, insight, and motivation that can guide us as individuals and as a society toward a more peaceful, just, and earth-honoring future. In terms of creation compliance, this is about accepting the urgency of learning to live in harmony with the rest of the created world rather than trying to dominate it. As a Christian, the words of Jesus keep echoing in my mind. From Luke chapter 9, 24 to 25, for those who want to save their life will lose it, but those who lose their life for my sake will save it. What does it profit them if they gain the whole world, but lose or forfeit themselves? We are in danger of losing ourselves and our planet. So we must surrender to the calling of humility, obedience to the dictates of God's creation, and a radical focus on building a just and equitable society and economic infrastructure that addresses the needs of the least of these, as Jesus called them, those who have particularly suffered under our oppressive reign. And so at the end of the chapter, I propose an image that I call the eco-ethical arc. And this is the idea that we need to come together across different denominations, across different faiths, across people who have no faith, and find the common ground, the common land, the common water that joins us together. Our eco-ethical arc must be built with planks of the strongest ethical teachings of each religion and faith and spiritual group. It must be supported with joists of justice and beams of righteousness. And the ark must be sealed by compassion that fills in the cracks and binds us together. The first ones on this ark must be the people and species who are most affected by climate change. As we build this eco-ethical ark, we must learn from those who have lived through and are currently suffering from the realities of the system's collapse. The colonialist traditions, the media executives, the advertisers, the rulers who have no heart for justice, all of them have had their time, and now their time is up. We in the wealthy West ignored the rest of the world as we created the problem. The time has come to repair what we have damaged and to cede our privilege and power to those with greater wisdom as we salvage what is left. And I do believe we can salvage what is left as we build this eco-ethical arc together. Thank you.
Yes. Amen. Thank you, Leah. Margaret.
It is a pleasure to be here, and I'm grateful for this circle of friends as we reflect together tonight. I'd like to read a section from the last chapter of Rooted and Rising, which is the chapter I wrote called Love Every Leaf. And I'll just preface it by saying I am very interested in how to protect the outer landscape, the living world that God entrusted to our care and that is now in such peril. But I'm also very interested in how we protect our inner landscape. How do we stay inwardly alive? How do we stay awake and aware, in touch with our feelings, in touch with our emotional response to the climate crisis? How do we stay attuned to the Spirit of God, which I believe is guiding us into a better future? So those are the questions that I address in this chapter. To me, it's all about prayer and meditation. In times like these, our prayer may need to be expressive and embodied, visceral and vocal. How else can we pray with our immense anger and grief? How else can we pray about ecocide, about the death that humanity is unleashing upon Mother Earth and upon ourselves? How else can we break through our inertia and despair so that we don't go numb? Because of all this, I've taken to praying outdoors. I go outside, feel the good earth beneath my feet and the wind on my face, and I sing to the trees, to oak and beech, hemlock and pines. Making up the words and music as I go along, I sing my grief to the trees that are going down, and my grief for so much more, for what we have lost and are losing, and for what we are likely to lose. I sing my outrage about these beautiful old trees being cut to the roots, their bodies chipped to bits and hauled away to sell. I sing my fury about the predicament we're in as a species. I sing my protest of the political and corporate powers that be, that drive forward relentlessly with business as usual, raising forests, drilling for more oil and fracked gas, digging for more coal, expanding pipeline construction, and opening up public lands and waters to endless exploitation, as if Earth were their private business and they were conducting a liquidation sale. I sing out my shame to the trees, my repentance and apology for the part I have played in Earth's destruction, and for the part my ancestors played when they stole land and chopped down the original forests of the native peoples who lived here. I sing my praise for the beauty of trees and my resolve not to let a day go by that I don't celebrate the precious living world of which we are so blessedly a part. I'm not finished until I sing my determination to renew action for trees and for all of God's creation. I feel God's presence when I pray like that. I dare to believe that the Spirit who longs to renew the face of the earth is praying through me. Praying like this leaves me feeling more alive, connected with myself and with the world I love. So our prayer may be noisy and expressive, or it may be very quiet. It may be the kind of prayer that depends on listening in stillness and silence with complete attention, listening to the crickets as they pulse at night, listening to the rain as it falls, listening to our breath as we breathe God in and breathe God out, listening to the inner voice of love that is always sounding in our hearts. A discipline of contemplative prayer or meditation can set us free from the frantic churn of thoughts and feelings and enable our spirit to rest and roam in a vaster, wilder space.
Thank you, Margaret. I feel like I want to give you a different kind of amen than the amen. We need all kinds of amens. Thank you. Natasha.
Thank you. I will be reading an excerpt about my personal and professional understanding of climate change and human health. This is written in chapter 10, called The View from My Window. I've heard it said that we are the first generation to experience the impacts of climate change and the last that can do something about it. For my part, I'm seeing those impacts of climate change in the form of severe threats to public health that worsen pre-existing health conditions and exacerbate health inequities. Extreme heat is increasing the incidence of asthma and heart disease and raising the risk of heat-related illnesses such as heat exhaustion and deadly heat strokes. In fact, extreme heat is the top cause of weather-related death in the US. And although extreme heat deaths are more preventable compared to other climate impacts, people without access to places where they can cool off on a hot day are the ones who particularly suffer. Gazing out my window, I think of climate experiences that have helped shape my life. One extremely hot summer afternoon stands out. My parents and I were gathering very large, heavy rocks to construct a stone walkway. We were in a largely unshaded area on a hill right off the interstate. I remember Mom saying that she needed to sit down. I recall noticing that she was sweating profusely, like nothing I'd ever seen before. She was short of breath, although she was sitting. Dad decided that she needed shade and water. When I looked in her eyes, I saw something I'd never seen in her before: helplessness. My mother is the strongest and most determined woman I know, but the look in her eyes let me know that something was seriously wrong. Realizing that the shade wasn't immediately helping, I wondered if her life was slipping away. I couldn't shake the terrifying thought of life without my mom. The woman who gave me life, who held my hand and kissed me when I was sick, who hugged me and told me she loved me every single day, whose attention made me feel that I was the only person in her world, and the woman who taught me to pray. Once Dad was able to get some some cold water, she started cooling off and feeling better. But she could have easily become another heat-related fatality statistic that day. The toxic combination of extreme heat plus strenuous activity, along with the poor air quality induced by the traffic emissions from the adjacent highway, created a perfect recipe for my mom's condition. This experience underscores my quest to halt global warming and prevent others from seeing their family members face the same climate-related health challenges. In my work, I emphasize that communities must find ways to help citizens adapt to the changing climate in order to protect health. This means that we need accessible cooling stations for extreme heat days, poor air quality alerts, and evacuation plans for extreme weather events that enable all vulnerable populations to be transported to safety. In addition to taking action steps to adapt, we must also advocate for climate change mitigation strategies that will reduce the release of pollutants and safeguard our communities from further climate harm. What's most alarming to me about the threat of climate change is the imbalance that's borne by those who suffer. Threats to public health affect everyone. However, some groups are more vulnerable than others. And ironically, those who have contributed the least to the climate crisis are the ones most burdened by it. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. Yes, thank you for that story and the framing that you offered to it. Jim.
Well, listen, I'm so grateful to the BTS Center for organizing this. If you're not familiar with their work on climate and related matters, go to their website. And it's an honor to join my fellow authors, Leah and Margaret and Natasha, and to see so many familiar names in the chat. Here's an excerpt from my chapter, Fighting Climate Change, Our Responsibility, Our Vocation, Our Salvation. There's a reason why those who rose to the challenge of resisting Hitler came to be known as the greatest generation. Between 1941 and 1945, with civilization in the balance, hundreds of millions of people accepted the reality that we don't get to do what we want. We have to do what needs to be done. Not only did this make their generation great, many found this reorientation personally fulfilling. It gave deep meaning to many lives. What if, in facing the threat that climate change presents to our personal hopes and dreams, we generated a change in the human prospect as fundamental and as universal as climate change? What if, by fully accepting that the activities of 7 generations of humans have wrecked our common home, we became free to embrace a fresh understanding of human fulfillment and vocation? The traditional understanding of vocation is best expressed by Fred Buechner's oft-quoted formulation that the place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. While important and beautifully stated, this description focuses on individual vocation and personal gladness. But living as we are in the days of Noah, our vocation must be communal as well as personal. And our vocation in these modern days before the flood is not determined by what makes each of us glad. The crisis we face places an inescapable moral claim on our generation and therefore on each one of us. We must do what urgently needs to be done using the unique gifts each of us brings. It's time to reread Scripture and embrace the theme that is everywhere apparent. God calls communities, not just individuals. If we collapse the notion of vocation into the shallow confines of a single life or a single lifetime, we're ignoring a major thrust of Scripture. Humanity itself now has a vocation. What would it be like to be a member of the generation that finally blew the whistle and declared, "Not on my watch"? It would involve relinquishing much of what we currently pursue in our quest for happiness and accepting that consumerism and selfishness will never satisfy our deepest longings. In subordinating our personal aspirations so that we can devote our lives to a larger calling, we may begin to understand Jesus' insight that those who lose their life will find it. Such devotion will create an unstoppable mandate to restore creation.
Yes, can you tell we have some preachers in addition to writers in this group? Thank you, Jim. We want to bring all of you into this conversation. And so we're going to invite you to do some reflecting and sharing in the chat, followed by an opportunity for our guest authors to respond to what you're sharing. So rather than the kind of typical Zoom Q&A with authors, this is going to feel a little more like storytelling and opportunities for resonating. So let's dive in. One of the quotes that has inspired the recent work of the BTS Center comes from environmental lawyer and advocate Gus Speth, who says, "I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address those problems. But I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that." End quote. This quote taps a vocational place for those of us at the BTS Center, a call to us. I'd like to invite all of us to pause for just a moment of silent reflection on this unique moment for people of faith to offer leadership. I'm going to mute and let us experiment with being quiet together online for just 1 minute. And now I'd like to invite all of you who are comfortable doing so to follow Florentino's example in the chat and share some stories, some examples of faithfully rooted courage in response to climate change. I'm going to put that prompt in the chat. Share examples of faithfully rooted courage in response to climate change. Maybe you were involved, maybe you weren't. Either way, what's surfacing for you as something you might share with this gathering? Let's take just a moment to type and read quietly. I'm going to invite each of our guest authors to kind of lift up or respond to something that's been shared in the chat. I'm going to invite Margaret to go first. And because you're first up, feel free, if you want to share your own story or example of faithfully rooted courage in response to climate change, feel free to do that, as some of your colleagues are having the 2 minutes that you take to share to look through what people are sharing. Please keep populating the chat with examples of faithfully rooted courage in response to climate change. Please, Margaret.
I will lift up Reverend Gretchen Elmendorf wrote a note. I know she's been one of the faith leaders who's protesting a compressor station here in Massachusetts. There's so many people of faith I know who are working to keep fossil fuels in the ground. Many of them traveled to northern Minnesota to try to stop Line 3. Some of us went to the local office in Waltham, Massachusetts of the Enbridge Corporation, which is behind Line 3, and blockaded, some folks blockaded the office for 26 hours. So I particularly want to cherish my faith colleagues who are willing to carry out acts of peaceful civil disobedience to stop construction of new fossil fuel infrastructure.
So important. Thank you, Margaret. Natasha, can I invite you to share something you're seeing, to respond to anything that's being populated in the chat?
Thank you so much. I applaud all the examples of courage that are here in the chat. It's so inspiring. So thank you to those who have shared. What has excited me is to see those that are inspiring courage in children in this space. The children will lead us, and children are our future, and utilizing the voices of children has made a difference, especially in the last couple of years. We've seen so much attention of young climate activists going on the Hill and reaching out to their Congress people. And these are children, youth-led. And so I applaud what Florentino has shared about engaging children. I also was excited to see what James shared about their daughter and her interest in chemistry and climate science. We need more women in STEM for certain, and to see this being instilled and supported and elevated is exciting, and it's what our future needs, but it's also what our right now needs.
Thank you, Natasha. Jim, what are you seeing in what people are sharing?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that somebody from the Midwest noted that local farmers are speaking out against various pipelines, and particularly the KXL pipeline. When I've been arrested several times in attempting to stop the KXL pipeline, and every single time I have had indigenous people and farmers, in fact, with me. In fact, one time, farmers and indigenous people rode their horses from the Midwest to Washington, and they described themselves as cowboys and Indians. It was quite a witness. Other things that I've seen are churches that participated in the climate voting pledges and dedicated those pledges in their worship service. Other churches welcoming weekly testimony in their worship services. And I know of one church, I didn't see it in the thing, but it may have been there, which had some members who were willing to do civil disobedience, and the congregation invited them forward, laid hands on them, and blessed them and supported them through their calling in that regard.
Thank you, Jim. Leah, could you share some of what you're seeing?
One of the things that I resonated with was, and I didn't see who said this, but I think I saw at least one or two comments about clergy showing up to public events with their clerical collars on to be a witness, to be a presence, to make sure that the public knows that the church is aware of this is in support of climate action, and that the false dichotomy between science and faith must be dissolved. Most Christians really have no problem understanding science or believing science, and we need to heal that rift. So I think it's very important that clergy and people of faith show up to these acts of civil disobedience and protest and peaceful nonviolence, so that we can be a witness, both with our eyes, but also with our voices, to say, this is part of who we are as people of faith, is to protect what God created.
Thank you, Leah. Margaret, Jim, Natasha, anything else you want to spotlight?
I'd just like to build on something that I think Leah and someone else said, which I think is so important. In 2011, when we sort of made the KXL pipeline a household word, one of the requirements of the organizers was that you had to have been born in Eisenhower's presidency or earlier in order to come forward. And what that did was it allowed we who are older, which is most of the people participating on this today, we who are older, to take responsibility for what our generation and 6 or 7 generations before us have done. But what's emerging now is a solidarity between the generations. And church is a place that can hold that solidarity and promote it and expand it.
Yes, I have often thought that our society is getting segregated by age so much, and congregations are this really special place where young people and older people still gather and find a common identity and belonging. Thank you for pointing that out. Margaret, anything you want to add here?
I just wanted to jump in to say, I was hearing resonances of this in the comments about planting pollinator gardens or planting community gardens. I think we have an important role to play in reclaiming or re-experiencing reverence for nature. What does it mean to perceive the natural world as sacred? That is such a transformation of consciousness. And I will just quickly say that in my little city of Northampton in Western Massachusetts, there's a little street in the middle of the city where there are 7 cherry trees that the city government wants to cut down so they can repave the road. Yesterday, I attended a Buddhist ceremony on the street where they ordained those 7 cherry trees as priests. It was one of the most sacred liturgies outdoors, carried out very soberly, joyfully, somberly, but honoring these trees as bearing witness to the sacred. And I'm not Buddhist, but I understand that language of, I just can't tell you how moving it was to see the priest place his hand very tenderly on the trunk of the tree and pray with the tree. And I was thinking, here in my Christian world, we have a blessing of the animals on St. Francis Day. What would it mean to turn that around and think about what would it mean to become a blessing to the animals? How can we live in such a way that we are a blessing to the trees and all the other living beings with whom we share this beautiful, precious world?
Yes, thank you for that image. That is very easy to connect to, that story that you just shared.
Native people grow up learning that we are responsible for taking care of the land. That's one of the reasons why we feel so close to our land. And when we were taken from our lands, it was so painful. And internationally, through the United Nations, there have been 2 decades for Indigenous peoples. And the work that those people did was about ecology. So when
Thank
I
you,
hear
Patricia.
somebody say it's a jar to your world, it's not to Native people's worlds.
Thank you. Thank you. So important. I want to offer deep gratitude to everyone who chimed in with a story or an example. This is such a rich list in the chat. So thank you. We will find a way to capture this and celebrate it. I want to shift gears a little bit at this point into a time of questions for our guest authors. And each of these questions is a question that I know they will welcome, as it taps something that they are thinking about, wrestling with, wanting to go deeper with right now in July of 2021. As compared to the excerpts from the chapters that they read that were authored well, I don't know how long it takes to publish a book, but a little while ago, a couple of years ago. So actually, I'm going to start asking a question to Natasha. I'll get to each of our guest authors, and we'll have a little bit of opportunity for one of our other guest authors to share a response to what people are offering. So, Natasha, at your invitation, I would like to invite you to reflect on some of the dynamics around people of color and relationship with nature. Speaking as someone who leads programs that often invite people to sit next to a tree or notice a butterfly or find contemplative ways to connect with the natural world, we often bump into the question of whether that's an equitable invitation for action. Do all people have access to nature as we're describing it? Do all people find those connections beneficial? What do we need to understand historically to do this work in a way that honors diversity and justice?
A fantastic question. Thank you so much, Nicole. Because there are people out there that say that people of color, African Americans specifically, don't care about nature, and that is simply untrue. We have a very complex history with nature. And throughout our existence here in the US, our number one goal has been survival. That can make it appear as if there are competing priorities between accessing nature and other pressing concerns. But survival has been goal number one, and certainly nature benefits health and quality of life. And then also consider that people of color or communities of color in particular, are often hit first and worst by climate and environmental hazards. But to frame things, I just want to briefly step through some of the historical context that informs this complex relationship. If we begin with the times of slavery, enslaved people were stripped of ties to the land, just as Patricia just shared with the group. Her comment just ties right into the spiritual and medicinal ties that African Americans once had. Those were stripped away in order to enslave us. Enslaved people also would hide in nature to escape. So nature became a safe haven for those who may have traveled the Underground Railroad, for example. And then post-slavery, we were promised the land. So there was enthusiasm and a hope and a future that came with the future of having land. And then we get to the Reconstruction times. The land was actively used to terrorize and instill fear in African Americans by way of lynching. And this left much trauma in the wake. And this won't be hard to hear, and it's not easy to say either. But my grandmother in her 90s revealed that there was a point earlier in her life where she was afraid to look up into trees for fear that she may see someone there. Now, this is a woman that I know to be an avid gardener, loves to spend time outdoors. that's the kind of trauma that this instilled that could be passed on to generations. And then also during Reconstruction, the land that was promised wasn't given. So that hope and that future that people saw tied to the land wasn't received. And in Jim Crow era, communities of color, people of color were excluded from the national park system, from the conservation movement. The national parks were developed really in its inception to be a playground for the wealthy. So this excluded a lot of populations from the national parks. And then there was the redlining of properties that limited African Americans to only live in certain areas. So if you fast forward to now, the historic redlining, those communities have hotter temperatures, they have more flooding, they have less trees and less green spaces. Communities of color often lack access to nature or even health services. We are underrepresented in conservation organizations, the staff, the leadership, and the boards. It's improving, but we are still underrepresented. So all of these factor into this perception. But ultimately, there are benefits of health and nature. There are certainly heart health benefits that my group does research on. There are mental well-being benefits as well from having access to nature. So I'm excited to share with you very briefly about the Green Heart Project. And this is a partnership between University of Louisville, the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, and the Nature Conservancy. And in this Green Heart Project, we are planting trees for healthier air. So we're looking at health indicators before and after tree planting, along with air quality before and after tree planting. So I'll be glad to share a link within the chat as a resource for this. But I want to share this as a real world example, as something that other cities are using and can use to help bring green equity to their communities.
Thank you, Natasha. I want to invite Leah to share what Natasha just shared, what that sparks for you.
Oh gosh, I was just so excited to hear her talk about trees in urban areas and what a difference that makes for property values and how it cools off our cities and creates places where children want to play. Where I live in Lexington, the University of Kentucky did 2 studies called Healthy Trees, Healthy People, where they studied, first of all, they trained people to become citizen scientists to observe tree health in cities and then take walks in city parks and log what they find on the trees to make sure that they're trying to look out for invasive species. So their health improves, the tree health improves, community health improves. It's just wonderful. And then I added a part called Healthy Faith, where I added devotionals to these walks. So it was just like this 3-legged stool to support this. The other thing I just really quickly want to say is building on Dr. DeJarnett's point about there need to be more children of color lifted up as champions of nature and young people doing this. So another author in Rooted and Rising is Karina Newsom, and she is an ornithologist, and her chapter is amazing. She's like the rock star Black female scientist. She's got thousands of Twitter followers, and she gets kids excited, urban kids excited about birds and animals and protecting their spaces. So really encourage you to get Rooted and Rising and read all of these chapters because they had just such inspiring stories.
Thank you, Leah. Jim, I want to turn to you and ask a question that I know you care about. In your chapter in Rooted and Rising, you quoted an op-ed piece from the New York Times that declares that humanity is perfect for taking on the impossible challenge of climate crisis because that's what humans do. We take on impossible challenges. Another way of saying this is that we are a really adaptable species. Recently, climate writer David Roberts takes a different view. He says that because humans are so adaptable, we can get used to anything. And so in some ways, it's our ability to adapt that is keeping us from focusing on the profound changes that the climate crisis has already brought to the earth on which we were born. So I know you like noodling around. Which is it? Is our ability to adapt salvific, or is it a curse we're working against?
So everybody on this Zoom has figured out that the BTS knows how to ask really good questions. Isn't that right, Dr. Natasha? So listen, the first thing I want to say is I would love to have every minister who is on this call or going to watch this Zoom to preach a sermon on the tension between adaptation as a gift and adaptation as a curse, okay? I'll just say a few things about it right now, but I think people would have very different takes on this. For me, there's no quick and easy answer. We have an ability to adapt. That's what allowed us to migrate out of Africa almost 2 million years ago and to settle in all over the world to survive in a whole bunch of different climates in every corner of the earth. Our ability to adapt is now a foundation for resilience. And the concept of resilience is something familiar to everybody in this meeting. Resilience serves as a cornerstone for survival as we face inconceivable heat, drought, wildfire, famine, food, pestilence, migration, and the violent conflicts that these disruptions are producing all over the world. Now, there's another way to look at adaptation. Our ability to adjust to new circumstances, to get used to rainstorms measured in feet, not in inches, to accept that the fire season is now year-round, not to be shocked when it's 50 degrees Fahrenheit above normal in the Arctic Circle. Our ability to accept a new normal and to adapt to it amounts to an abdication of our intergenerational responsibilities. Because if and as we get used to a new normal that is essentially the degradation of the earth on which we were born, what we are doing is stealing our children's future. So I say thank God for our ability to adapt, and thank God for our calling, the calling of our generation to refuse to accept the climate crisis as the new normal.
Thank you, Jim. Let's get some response to what you've offered for us. Could you chime in, Margaret, with what you heard and what Jim is challenging us with?
I always enjoy hearing what Jim has to say. So I'll just briefly offer a thought or two in response. Because I hear this critique of adaptation, the ambiguity of adaptation, and it brings to mind the serenity prayer. You know, I'm an addict in recovery, and so that's one of my go-to prayers, praying for the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So I'm hearing a critique of a certain kind of serenity, which says, oh, I just have to accept this. This is normal, this is regular. So I'm thinking that is serenity. Well, it's sort of apathy and inertia disguised as serenity. So that brings to mind a couple of quotes. One is from years ago, I studied Russian literature, and so Crime and Punishment comes to mind. There's a line in Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky's novel, when the character says, "Men are scoundrels, they can get used to anything." This kind of bitter message, we can get used to anything, we're scoundrels. And a slightly less bitter, but equally bracing, maybe more inspiring quote from Thomas Merton. It's attributed to Thomas Merton. The biggest human temptation is to settle for too little. So I see that, I must say that I see that as one of the roles that faith communities can play, is to not let us settle for too little. We will not settle for ruining the world. We will not settle for inhabiting a society and an economy that are devouring the web of life. We will not settle for white racism. We will not settle for anything less than a world in which all beings can thrive. And that gives us our moral compass of that's the world we want to be creating.
Thank you, Margaret.
Adapt to that world.
Jim, I wonder if you want to take just a moment to respond to anything that Margaret just said.
Well, Margaret's comments and her two quotes, of course, could be utilized by anybody writing a sermon. So point number one, always turn to Margaret for good quotes. But point number two, I think Leah may have put into the chat a question as to whether or not I have written about this, and the direct answer to that is no. And I want to go back to where I began, which is as I've been pondering this, and I've been talking about it in the various keynotes and sermons that I've given in the past year, I really think this is a challenge for all of us to deal with. And coming from a pulpit should be the place where we wrestle with this tension and help then the people in our congregation to sort of bear witness with it themselves. So I just want to give that shout out and encouragement to all congregations. This is a way to engage climate change. So many pastors, they worry like, how do I engage climate change? Here's an example. Do we accept a new normal too easily? Do we thrive as adapters and thereby pull the rug out from underneath our children? Those are great sermon topics.
Thank you, Jim. I want to turn to Leah, and I know she has a few things to say about preaching, but actually the question I want to ask you, Leah, is something I know you have been investigating quite a bit recently, and investing a lot of time and energy into wondering how we know if what we're doing is making a difference. What in the world does success look like? How do we know where we should best put our limited time and resources? And so this is around measurement and monitoring and evaluation and some of those things that I was a math major. I love this stuff, I will tell you. But some of these things that sometimes we shy away from, but are so, so critical. And if you have anything you want to say in response to that exchange between Margaret and Jim, of course, the floor is yours to do so.
All right, great. Well, let me first of all start with metrics, because I really think this is where the church needs to go. I'm all for the spiritual aspect of nature. I love all of that. But I'm feeling more and more that we need to be able to show that our work is making a difference, and we need to do that with facts and figures. And so one of the things that I have done at the Lexington Theological Seminary, we just completed a certificate program in creation and the church. And before we started the program, what we did was we sent out a survey to our students to establish a baseline of where are we with regards to do your congregations have a creation care team? Do they have composting, like a whole list of things like what do you do? What are the attitudes of the congregation? When have you last heard a sermon? So some certain things that would give us an indication of here's where we are in terms of our creation compliance and compassion. And then after having completed this year's worth of courses, we are sending out now another survey to see what difference did it make. And to say, okay, we've seen that now, we've seen an attitude change go up or down, or we've seen people say that they're more willing to talk about this in their congregations. So I don't have the results from that yet because we're still getting the information back, but that's one thing that I would like to see. The other thing is that I want to draw on something that Jim has written about, which is to challenge leaders to put 25% of their time, talents, and treasures into addressing climate and environmental issues. And so that specific number is really important, because then again, we can measure. So let's say a denomination like the UCC says, all right, we're going to put that challenge out there that we want to see all pastors, all congregations devote 25%. But it's going to be a little bit difficult to get there. So I've given some steps to this. So let's say we start with 10%, what I call the creation tithe, right? Where you've got certain things that you can do to up the congregation's game on lowering your carbon footprint. And then you do the double tithe, where you do certain other things. You give people a list of things that they can do to meet that. And then you do the last 5, what I call the strive for 5, to get us to that 25%. You do that over, say, a 3-year period, and you can make it like a friendly competition among congregations and among regions or synods, Lutherans, so we have synods. So to make it fun, to make it a challenge, but then you can say, all right, we were here, but now we're here. And we know we're here because we have the numbers, we have the metrics, we have the data.
Thank you, Leah. Let's get some data, friends. Jim, can I invite you into reflecting on what Leah is talking about here?
Well, there's a lot there, and I always enjoy listening to what's top of Leah's mind. First of all, it's no surprise that Leah teaches at a seminary, but I want to sort of up the ante in regard to and begin by praising her seminary for taking metrics seriously and doing those measurements that she began by talking about. Why isn't every seminary doing this? Why isn't every seminary doing what Leah's second point was, which is to say 25% of the seminary curriculum should focus on preparing pastors to lead in a climate changing world? How can we not do that? We will look back at this time and people will say, what were they thinking when they knew everything we know about climate change? And we continue the curriculum that we were using in the 70s or the 60s or the 50s. So that's my first comment. It's not really about metrics, but it is about participation. The second thing I want to do relates to what Leah's second point was, to challenge people, which I have written about in my book, Climate Church, Climate World, to devote, some huge portion of their life to address climate change by doing an inventory of their gifts and calling, and then turning that in order to pull that off. But let me just give a little advice to congregations, not only to pastors, but other leaders in congregations. Don't think of your congregation as this building on the corner and the material contributions that all of your congregation makes or that your endowment makes to your congregation. Your congregation is all of that plus all of the income by every family in your church, all of the property owned by every family in your church. So if you think about putting a solar panel on the top of your church, expand that to say, gee, how many in our congregation have solar panels? And then following Leah's suggestion, you can begin to say, we have 5% of the congregation already using solar energy. Can we get to 10%? Can we get to 25%? What about the church roof? It reconceptualizes our sense of individual autonomy and sets that aside for a sense of communal calling.
Can I just jump in real quick? Because I'm seeing some
Please.
things in the comments that are just really, really important. Recognizing that some anxiety about, well, these are just little steps. And two things I want to say about that. First of all, I don't want us to underestimate the power of these smaller steps to create a culture of change. I know sometimes it feels like, this isn't enough. We need huge, big change things to happen right now. But remember, people of faith, we have this parable about the mustard seed. We've got the yeast in the dough, these tiny things that all of a sudden create this tipping point, and all of a sudden the dough rises. Now, I am not saying to use that as like, okay, we changed our light bulbs, we're all done, we checked the box, we can go home, we can feel really good about ourselves, and really nothing has changed. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, let's not underestimate the power of these things that are collectively creating a huge movement. We are in the midst of a movement. So I just want to be very clear that this isn't just about incremental. This is about big picture. This is about grassroots and treetops all at the same time.
Yes, thank you, Leah. And I think this conversation brings us to the question that I wanted to bring forward to Margaret, which is the question of what might be, what is and what might be the very special role of faith leaders and faith communities in this time of climate change. One of the things I've been wondering about along the lines of what Leah just shared is, what does it look like to add the lens of prayerful intention and spiritual discipline to some of these actions that may seem small? My family has recently adopted really going after composting. And so what does it mean to actually, and it's not easy to keep doing it after every meal. So what does it mean to actually hold that with intention, with prayer, and with knowing that this is comparable to a spiritual discipline? Now, I bring you into this conversation that's kind of been going back and forth, but Margaret, we really welcome your wisdom on the role of faith communities.
Oh, thank you, Nicole. I think that faith communities there's a very particular roles that we can play in the midst of the climate crisis. And I thought I would just quickly name 4 of them, and there are plenty more that we could name if there were more time, but I'll just name 4. One is faith communities can address helplessness. People who are worried about the climate crisis often don't take action because they feel helpless, they feel overwhelmed, they are convinced it's too late to make any kind of difference. They slide into what climate scientist Michael Mann calls doomism. And that's the point where we kind of throw up our hands, call it quits. It's too late to be of use. And, if we make that choice, that's exactly what the fossil fuel companies would love to have us do. So we begin as faith communities to address helplessness, I think, simply as we gather for prayer, meditation, worship. We see each other's faces, we hear each other's voices. When we're in person, we take hold of each other's hands. We feel the power of connection to a community that longs, as we do, to create a better future. And we also bring ourselves consciously into the presence of a divine power, a power greater than ourselves, in whose presence we are strengthened and uplifted, and to whom we are accountable. So whether or not we are, quote unquote, successful in protecting the web of life and averting climate chaos, people of faith don't have time for helplessness. We know we have a job to do. We need to avert as much suffering as we can, to heal and reconcile as much as we can, and to live in balance with earth and with each other as much as we can. So that's one. Second role of faith communities is we can offer transformative rituals and practices, just to name a few. In a time of climate crisis, we need rituals that remind us of our connection with each other and with the rest of the living world and with the unseen source of all that is. We need rituals that ask us to confront our guilt and that grant us forgiveness and that set us free to amend our lives and to choose a new course. We need rituals that remind us how loved we are, how precious the world is, and what a privilege it is to be born in a time when our choices and our actions make such a difference. Really, what we do in the next 5 to 10 years really matters. I was recently reminded of the Elm Dance, which is a sacred circle dance that Joanna Macy often shares in her work with people who have suffered massive collective trauma. You know, I think we're all living in a world of trauma right now. So let's dance, let's sing, let's lament, let's meditate and pray, and let's keep our spirits strong. The more we experience our unshakable union with a love that is stronger than death, the more willing we will be to take action commensurate with the emergency we are in. Third thing faith communities can do, we can provide moral leadership. The climate crisis is forcing us to face existential questions about the meaning and purpose and the value of human life. What does it mean to be human if human beings are destroying life as it has evolved on this planet? What is our moral responsibility to future generations, or to the poor and the historically marginalized and underserved, who, as Dr. Natasha said, are those hurt first and worst by the effects of climate change and are least likely to have a seat at the table where policy decisions are made. So faith communities provide a context for grappling with these difficult questions and for finding moral grounding and guidance, and for reminding us of such old-fashioned virtues as justice and generosity. And finally, faith communities can inspire bold action. At their best, faith communities have a long history of leading movements for social and environmental justice. Our faith can tap into our capacity to dedicate ourselves to a cause greater than personal comfort and self-interest. And as many people have pointed out in the chat, an adequate response to the scope and speed of the climate crisis requires collective action and political engagement. So I hold out the possibility that people of faith around the world will rise up together to resist a deathly status quo and will awaken the general public out of its and our apathy and inaction. And I just want to mention, COP26, the next UN climate summit, will be held in November. 2 weeks before it begins, Green Faith is organizing something called Faiths for Climate Justice, a global multi-religious action, October 17th and 18th. I'll drop a link in the chat. So it's an invitation to faith communities around the world to make their voices known, their presence known. So I'll just say,
thank you, Margaret.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all for this conversation. Natasha, you're hanging out with a bunch of reverends right now, and sometimes it's really helpful to get a non-reverend's response to these conversations. So, Natasha.
Well, thank you. I should tell you, I am very comfortable because I come from a family of reverends. So I'm very comfortable to sit and soak in all the amazing wisdom. And that's what I have been doing. And I especially love what Margaret has shared about the role of faith communities. It's a big role, keeping people encouraged within action on the climate crisis that affects so much: justice, equity, health, the economy. All will have benefits from this action, but through the lens of faith, through the moral imperative of action, keeping people encouraged in that space is especially important, because there's something, I've lost the word as I'm trying to say it. There's a burden of knowing what we know about the climate events that further causes mental health challenge as well. So staying encouraged, and this is an ongoing process, especially for people that work in this space a lot. Knowing what we know can be an added burden. So keeping people encouraged is especially important, but also knowing and walking in that you are trusted messengers in this space. I always think of my friend's mom. My friend has a PhD in public health. She is absolutely brilliant, has led agencies all across the US, transformed lives and health. Her mom does not listen to her at all. Now, that could be a mother-daughter thing, right? But it's also that her mom says clearly, if my pastor says it, then I will listen. So you're trusted messengers. You have great influence over people. You are key educators in this space, and walk in that. And then in terms of courage, we saw so many amazing examples of courage in the chat earlier, and certainly throughout what all has been shared by the great panelists. Courage to certainly walk the talk is quite important as you are instilling these values in others. To be able to walk the talk also sets an example as well, but also understand that you nor your congregations have to be an expert. You don't have to be a climatologist. You don't have to be a climate scientist. You have been given unique gifts, and the diversity of the examples of courage that were shared before demonstrate that if we operate in our gifts, the doors will open for us. You don't walk this walk alone. I also want you to know that there are many opportunities to partner with health, partner with academia, partner with others that share different expertise that can help serve the goal. And certainly we here in academia and otherwise are ready to support. So thank you for the opportunity, and it's wonderful to learn from everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, everyone, for being part of this. As we move towards the end of our time together, we want to shift gears and create space for contemplative practice. So we're going to draw back to the structure that this book invites us into. Each section in this book spotlights 3 very diverse voices and perspectives. And then the section ends with questions for consideration and spiritual practice. This book is set up to be used in your community. And so in the chat box, as we've been like promoting this book sort of this whole time, we will share with you in the chat that we are able to get a very special discount code from the publisher for all of you who are attending this. So we'll put that information in the chat, and we hope that you will get your own copy of the book. Alan, why don't you lead us into not the talky point part of the book, but the reflecting part that it invites us into?
Sure, happy to do that. Thank you, Nicole. Well, with gratitude for today's conversation and maybe some appreciations and wonderings stirring in your mind, I'm just really grateful to all of you for being here and grateful to our speakers and leaders. I want to invite you now into a very simple kind of contemplative practice. This comes directly from the book. Each section has a practice. This one is adapted by Margaret based on a meditation that she learned from Tilden Edwards, based on the natural movement of our bodies as we breathe in, receiving the divine mystery who makes a home in us, and then breathe out, encountering the divine mystery who makes a home in the world around us. The God of love and compassion who is with us in creation and particularly identifies with those who are powerless and poor. So first I want to invite you, if you know how to navigate the Zoom room a little bit, to put yourself in gallery mode. It will be helpful for this practice if you can see others who are sharing this Zoom space with you. I want to first invite you to find a comfortable position in the seat where you're sitting. Let your feet feel grounded in the earth beneath you, and take a couple of deep breaths. And then let your breathing find its natural rhythm. If you're comfortable, I invite you to place your palms together at your heart like this. Certainly do what feels comfortable or meaningful for you. But if you're comfortable or if you find this meaningful, I invite you to do this. This might express your intention to live from your heart, to be mindful, awake, and fully present to each moment. And then I invite you to extend your arms out in front of you and make a small bowl or cup with your hands, if you find that comfortable or meaningful. This might express your desire to offer what you can to the world, to say a kind word, to give a healing touch. And now, if you find this comfortable or meaningful, I invite you to clasp yourself with your arms. Cross your arms over your chest, as if giving yourself a hug. This might express your willingness to receive the love of God, to be fully embraced by the divine compassion and peace. And now release your arms and extend them in front of you and out to the sides if you can. It would be great if we could try to almost pretend like you're touching the people who are next to you in the square. Imagine that we are connected across time and space in this moment, in this right here in this Zoom room. And this might express your desire to love fully and freely, offering nothing back, to share love as freely as you have received it. And then when you're ready, return your palms to your heart and offer whatever word or phrase you might find meaningful. Amen, thank you, may it be so, or just a big affirming yes. And now back to you, Nicole, to end our time.
Thank you so much, Alan. This final piece is just an invitation to stay connected. So clearly, we would love for each of you to get a copy of the book, Rooted in Rising. If you haven't already, please make use of that discount code. And we, in 2020, at the BTS Center, convened this cohort group that Alan referenced, and we had 7 guest authors come speak, and we would love for you to make use of those resources, those video resources of guest authors speaking with our group. We know of other congregations who've used this book curricularly in their congregations. So you can access those. We're putting in the chat right now where you can access those resources for bringing this book not only to your personal nightstand, but also to your community for growing deeper. We also would love for you to continue to journey with the BTS Center. Signing up for our newsletter is the best way to do that. And we're going to pop in the chat now a way to do that through our website, but then also a form that'll take you in the back end. If you visit our exhibit in the virtual exhibit hall, you'll see that we have some drawings being offered for people who sign up at this UCC General Synod. So if you want to be a part of that special thing, you can go right to this form that Kay is putting in the chat, enter your information. You'll continue to hear about our events, and maybe you'll be a winner. I'd love to invite the voices of Jim, Leah, Margaret, and Natasha one more time to share a final thought, a final blessing, whatever each of you is feeling moved to offer at this moment. And the 4 of you, please, if there are ways that people can stay in touch with you or books that you want to share, you have authored many, many things beyond Rooted in Rising. So pop those in the chat. And make sure that we can stay in touch with you and your very good work also. Jim.
I've been watching the chat, and very briefly, what I want to urge people who have participated in this to focus on is shift your focus from the demand side of the problem of climate change to the supply side, okay? The demand side is all about blaming ourselves. That's just what the fossil fuel companies want to do. The demand side is focused on reducing the demand for fossil fuel. Thank you, and I've posted my stuff in the chat.
Leah.
I just want to say that in addition, well, first of all, gratitude for BTS, for the UCC, for Margaret, who has been my partner in all of this. Natasha, Jim, your chapters are incredible. And there are 21 chapters in all in this book. And male, female, LGBTQ, Black, Latinx, Native American. I mean, we tried to get a really good representative of different voices of people of faith who are grappling with what I call the dark night of the green soul, which I heard a lot of that in the comments. And I keep coming back to these chapters time and again. I mean, the book is almost 2 years old now, and I keep coming back to it because it gives, every time I circle back around, I find something new. I find a tidbit. I find the wisdom, the support, the encouragement that I need. And so reach out to other people in your congregation. You're not alone in this work. When we do this together, we can be so effective in bringing about the vision that God has for creation and for our community. Thank you.
Margaret.
I'd like to leave everyone with a question, which is, if this conversation, listening to this conversation, participating in this conversation, were a turning point in your life of climate activism, what kind of turning point would it mark?
Thank you. Natasha.
Thank you so much. I hope you leave encouraged that there's no wrong way to do this work other than in action. Thank you so much to Reverend Nicole, Reverend Alan Kay, the BTS Center for organizing such a wonderful session. I am beyond grateful for the opportunity to glean from the wisdom of Reverends Leah, Margaret, and Jim. And I'll share my contact information here in the chat. Thank you all.
All right, friends, we come to the end of our time together. May our spirits stay strong. If you feel so moved, click to gallery view and let's offer a posture of gratitude to one another for this time spent together. If you can see one another sharing a posture of gratitude, thank you to everyone moving into that posture. And now let us wave because we are signing off, but with love.